know, and it's slightly different than the way I pitched it to you, then, because I play around with titles, as I'm working on the thing. So yeah, timing works out sometimes.
Not too bad. Kudos.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm going to start letting people in. Emily, you ready?
I'm ready, Freddie. Let's do it.
Cool. All right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our expanded Education Policy Brown Bag series, hosted by the Educational Leadership Policy faculty here in the College of Education at Texas Tech. My name is Jacob Kirksey. I'm an assistant professor here in the program, and it is great honor of mine to introduce our speaker for today. Emily W. Anderson is an assistant professor of international and intercultural education in the Department of Educational Policy Studies and affiliate faculty with the Center for Women's and Gender Studies at Florida International University. Dr. Anderson earned a dual title Ph.D. in Educational Theory and Policy and Comparative and International Education from the Pennsylvania State University, an MA in Comparative and International Education with a Sociology concentration, and an MED in Educational Leadership, both from Lehigh University. Dr. Anderson researches the cultural diffusion of education policy discourses, most often through qualitative and network approaches. She's published extensively in comparative and international education outlets, including the Comparative Education Review, Annual Review of Comparative and International Education, and Compare, a journal of comparative and international education. So it's without further ado, I'm happy to turn it over to you, Dr. Anderson, for today's talk entitled Gender as an Organizing Framework for International Education Development Policy in the Millennium and Sustainable Development Goal Eras.
Thank you so much, Jacob, for your warm welcome and introduction. And thank you all for being here. I'm super excited to get to spend some time with you this afternoon. So I join you from Miami, Florida, where it is very sunny. And that always reminds me to think about all the places we come from when we join a space together like this. So feel free to note in the chat where you're joining us from. And it's so great to see all of you here. I'd also like to give a special thank you to Dr. Alexander Wiseman for his continued collaboration. And it's so wonderful to get to share space again here with you, Alex, and all of your colleagues joining us from around the world. So the work that I'm going to be sharing with you today is part of really a long-term research project that started when I was a PhD student at Penn State. And so the stories that I'll share with you today reflect not only the original intentions of the research project, but how it's evolved as I've evolved as a scholar over the past feels like long time, many years. And so really the work that's I'm sharing with you in this talk comes from an article that is now published ahead of print in Compare. And so I thought it would be useful to share the citation with you below in case you are interested in thinking about these ideas further from what I share with you today. And my contact information is available here should you want to be in conversation together following this session. So as we get started, I want to really frame the work around one of the ways that a girls' education policy worker talked about sort of this ongoing disquiet that I was feeling in thinking about the relationship between girls' education and women's empowerment, which is really the discourse that brought me to this work and the one that I will hope to unpack with you today through this presentation. And so when I was speaking with this person about sort of how they think about empowerment, I was really thinking about it around it being a dominant discourse that is sort of applied in lots of different contexts, particularly when we're talking about the relationship between education and women's economic empowerment. And I was really curious to see if anyone else sort of shared this disquiet that I was experiencing as I was reading the literature and sort of coming to understand myself as a scholar who is interested in girls' education, but also in the ways that education prepares or doesn't girls who become women, thinking about that generational sort of, generational factor that happens when we educate girls, and sort of what happens when women later in life can enter the labor market or pursue higher education, for example. And so as this person shared with me in their own sense making around those ideas, that people are not quite attaching empowerment in a broad sense with girls. And they offered that instead it becomes this default to education, sort of as a de facto type of empowerment, and that's the primary type of empowerment for girls, and that everything else they need will come once they become women. And so as I was beginning this research and speaking with people that were sort of in the nexus between education policy and international development, these are some of the themes that kept coming up in conversation. And so I always like to begin with the words of the folks that are kind enough to share their experiences with me in a research context, because it's really their experiences that come through the data and also how I interpret it. And so the question that I've been thinking about for a long time, that's really the one that I share in this article, is how did girls become a population of interest to achieving women's empowerment and gender equality? Because these are ideas as a dominant discourse that we all sort of take for granted. And so for folks like me that were sort of troubled by the relationship that's embedded within the words we use to talk about the value of education, particularly for women and girls, and how those ideas are embedded in the ways we think about international development, this question really was important for me to not only be able to name, but to really use as an organizing framework for thinking about gender. And so I'll draw our attention to the policy contexts that have situated us in this empowerment, meaning everything kind of moment we've been in the last 2 years. I'm sorry, the last 20 years. And so it really, the focus on empowerment, we can really draw from not only the policy instruments that preceded the MDGs, but particularly thinking about how education and women's empowerment and girls' education and women's empowerment have been pursued as policy goals within the global goals era. And so as just a note, I'm speaking about the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals, which coming together are referred to as the global goals. And so to note that the Millennium Development Goals were initiated in the year 2000, they went through 2015, and they were picked up by the SDGs, which go from 2015 to 2030. And so we are, we've got about 10 years, a little less to 8 years to go in longer in the SDG era, but the themes that were the policy foci for the MDGs really were continued in the SDGs with some modification. And so the words that we use to understand and to describe what policy is are important to interrogate, because from the work that I do and the work that I cite, we often think about, oh, these are words that don't mean anything, right? They're taken for granted, we throw them around, but we can actually think about them as very strategic policy language that then informs the way we think about the role of education in society. And so I was interested in not only the words that we use to describe those processes in a policy context, but then what happens when they exist sort of out there in the public space. And so with those policy contexts in mind, I began to think about gender as this organizing framework. And that really helped me to conceptualize policy discourses that target, that use gender, right, to target populations, and then sort of help us to sort of think about the problems and solutions that are associated with education in an international development context. And so through this work, I discovered sort of three big things that policy discourse does, right? Or in the way that gender organizes it, is that gender can construct populations. And so in my work, both reflected here and more broadly, I've been thinking a lot about the ways that populations are constructed around gender and age. And so gender organize it by sort of using sex as a proxy for how we classify people. And age plays a role in thinking about the division or the lines that we draw, arbitrarily or not, between what girls need, right, it's even in the girls' education literature, we think about understanding girlhood in different ways. The UN has some pretty specific criteria that they use in thinking about who counts as a girl, but those ideas are not necessarily, carried with the discourses as they're diffused over time. And so this idea of gender and generation became really important in thinking about how the discourses are constructed. I also began to think about, as I played with the data over many years, the ways that gender can constrain parameters. And I realized that what we talk about as having value, right, in a policy context, or where we want to sort of move money and move people and build capacity, is really a story that's told by time and by looking at the sort of layering of different political and economic agendas around gender. And so with those two things in mind, through the data, I was really able to see that gender organizes policy discourse by creating pathways between policy problems and potential solutions, really targeted to particular individuals that we construct around gender and age over time and agenda. And so as we speak further this afternoon, I'm going to walk you through some examples of what that looks like. And so to do this work, I oriented it in critical feminist policy discourse analysis, using most often a feminist institutional perspective with some post-structural leanings. I think that that's the most fair way that I can reflect on my own work at this moment. And so I've been using Alan's work around the goal of policy discourse analysis is to really uncover what she talks about as the most obvious and familiar. And so to do that, I used evidence that was sourced from policy documents authored and published by UNGEI, which is the United Nations Girls Education Initiative, and UN Women, which we know began as UNIFEM, and looking at those policy documents that were published over time, over the last 20 years, beginning in 2000, and sort of data collection. I suspended data collection in 2020. So the policy documents were compiled, the corpus was compiled in two different time points. And so at first I started with a corpus of approximately 140 policy documents authored by UN and UNGEI. And then I refined those over time to think about the ones that most thoughtfully connected with this, the research question. Again, how did girls become a population of interest to achieve women's empowerment and gender equality? And so the refined sample of policy documents reflected 55 collected at two time points, 40 in 2014, and then an additional 15 in 2021 when I updated the analysis. And so I also engage with policy workers in what I refer to as the girls' education space. I focused on a strategic sample using convenience and non-probability sampling strategies, as is, as a mostly qualitative person these days. And so I was thinking about not necessarily the importance of talking to a lot of people, but really talking to folks who I thought were in positions to reflect both on the history of the girls' education within the global goals, and those that also were in positions where they were implementing the sort of policy discourse or existing within the policy discourses that I explore in this work in their everyday lives. And so I had the opportunity to speak with 10 of those folks, upper division policy workers in the girls' education space in spring 2014. And to work with the data, I used qualitative procedures, starting with empowerment as a reference term. Specifically, I started with the policy documents before I engaged in the interview processes, really so that I could, be reflective and also go back, revisit the themes that emerged in the document set. And so again, returning to how I worked with the data, I set the text as the analytic unit. And so I pulled specific sections of text where empowerment was used as a reference term. And then I was able to use inductive, deductive, and causation coding, mostly from Saldana's work, to think about how empowerment was situated in conversations that linked girls' education to gender equality. And so through that, I was able to also show, again, thinking about time and agenda and the role that those things play in the ways that we construct policy discourse. I was able to think about how they diffused over time and developed a method to visualize them to help me as I work through the policy documents and also tell a story that was in time and over time. So there are a couple of changes from when I first started this work to where it is now in its sort of most currently published versions, is that the position that I took as researcher at the time was very different than the position that I hold now. And so when we're thinking about position, we can think about it as not only the sort of role that I have, and so I'm an assistant professor at FIU, go Panthers, but also thinking about where and what space I take in the literature. And so I identify in now and then as an American white woman studying international policy discourses that involve gender, most often outside of my personal experience as a student or as a scholar. And so what that means is that I carry with me all kinds of things related to my own association with empowerment, right? The ways that education does or does not empower girls, and then how that plays out, sort of that development divide as it's talked about in the literature over time. And so through this conversation today, I'm going to sort of highlight things that I would have done differently in not only the methodological pieces of the work, but also how I thought about it along the way. And so there's a couple limitations that I want to highlight in the evidence that's used, particularly for the updated corpus. And so remembering that the analysis really started in 2014, which is when I started building the document corpus that was then further contextualized by interviews with girls' education workers in the girls' education policy space, is that I made some decisions around sampling that I would make differently. And also there are less documents published by, in particular, UNGEI that met the inclusion criteria than there were when I began the data collection in 2014. And so that matters when we're thinking about how we talk about discourse diffusion over time and how we make sense of that, both in an academic inquiry sense, but also how we make sense of it in a practical sense. So the idea is that that dominant discourses dominate other ways of thinking and talking about education policy goals. And so thinking about the limitations of updating the corpus is that there's less to say now than there was before. Some of that I think is going to unpack over time. And so this is work that I'm committed to, that I believe that as I move forward in my career, I'll continue to revisit, but really thinking about not only how I would approach sampling a bit differently and how I would think about representation in my sample, but also the limitations of using a smaller corpus when we're thinking about bringing ideas as they were unpacked, right, in the policy documents that I focused on in 2014, and sort of what the updated corpus has to say about that now. And so as I worked with the data, three different sort of discourses emerged for me. And again, we're thinking about gender as an organizing framework that is for international comparative policy discourses within the global goals era. That little asterisk there, we're really breaking at 2020, knowing that we have 10 more years to go. So I observed that there were three kinds of discourses that were happening. One, the dominant discourse that was used to diffuse MDGs 2 and 3, and later SDGs 4 and 5, used a tight binary construction of gender, and it really doubled down on the idea of aged constructions. And so we interpret that for this work as a tight binary construction of gender means that there are men and women, boys and girls. And that we see too, the way the age plays a role in there is that age and gender coupled together create those target populations of interest. And so returning to the framing quote that I shared with you at the beginning of our talk is that girls' education policy workers are very aware of sort of the bounds of talking about girls, and that there's this sensibility that the generational aspect of women's empowerment and how education may or may not push that is always around this sort of tight construction of gender and age. And I also observed that there were these other things that were happening that for me were more sort of exciting, but also more curious than the dominant discourse, because dominant discourses dominate. They exist and persist in ways that sort of shape our experience in the social world. What they are not the only ways that discourses or that gender is used to organize large-scale policy discourses, and then what we do with them at the practical level. And so I observed that there were also parallel discourses that considered that sort of broke this idea that population targeting is either man or woman, either boy or girl, right? Keeping gender and age together, but that there was this idea of population interdependence. And so I refer to that in this work as yoked populations. And that term, I apply it from network analysis, which really thinks about the interdependence of data, right? And so we can think about populations as also being interdependent. And the way that I observed that, the discourse sort of shifted from those tight binary constructions to yoked populations is where we split the difference between gender and age. So where in the dominant discourse we'll have, women, and we associate a particular age or understanding of age and developmental level with that. Parallel discourses sort of broke the age and also the genderedness of how we organize populations to think about bringing the boys and girls and women and girls together. And so I observed that interdependence as sort of this additive that reflected the ways that women were brought into international development policy by really not changing the policy goals or how they were constructed right at the UN level, or even how they're made sense of at the practice level, but instead to really think about, excuse me, that what happens when we add, right, when we break the binary and we break the age designation, and then we sort of bring in or add children to discussion, to policy conversations that are really focused on adults, and then how we sort of complicate gender, not by changing the binary constructions, but again splitting it to add boys into policy discourses that were focused on girls. And so I also noticed that there were things that were happening in the data as I observed them over time, is that there were little disruptions that at first I thought were really signaling that they were a standalone discourse. In other words, that they would sort of say, oh, okay, here are discourses that are just talking about girls as populations of interest. And so when I was coding the data originally, that was super interesting because I was able to say, there are policies that exist for women, there are policies that exist for children, and there are policies that exist in a way that try to add everybody into the mix. But the idea of a disruptive discourse is that it signals change rather than being a standalone discourse, as I first sort of theorized it to be, is that discourse disruptions signal change and also signal sort of this transformation of a discourse where instead of focusing on women or girls, right? And then women and girls, we're really thinking about girls on their own as a unique and distinct population from boys and from children and from women, but also thinking about the ways that gender can be disrupted when we sort of undo the associations that we make between what it means to be a person in the world that identifies with a certain gender or gender identity. And so it's really interesting to see how the disruptions can sort of hint at changes to dominant discourses. And it shows that those things always happen sort of over time in ways we might not be able to see without the time to see them. And so I want to show you what, again, sort of how these ideas of dominant discourses, parallel discourses, and disruptive discourses were applied in the global goals era. And we see again that the dominant discourse really focused on the idea of education for women's empowerment. And so the idea that that we educate girls, right? Or that we're thinking about educating women in, non-agricultural, that is actually in the goal, for non-agricultural related jobs, and that we're thinking about education as a way to empower women economically. So the economic framing of empowerment is really, really tightly bound within the dominant discourses, the dominant discourse that I study over time within the global goals era. And so because girls were added on to this larger policy structure that privileged women, we see that girls' education became for women's empowerment. And there we see that the populations sort of were yoked to include to disrupt not only age, but also gender, but to expand the focus from just girls and women to men and boys and girls and boys. And then here we see too that the disruptive discourse that emerged from my work with the data was really thinking about girls' education for gender equality. So considering girls as, again, a unique and distinct population from boys and from children, and then challenging our own sort of constructions of gender and why that matters when we're talking about education for social justice and gender transformation in working with youth. And so now I want to show you how I, really visualize these trends over time. And so part of the coding mechanism that I used in working with the data is that I coded in a way that would allow me to really show the themes and the trends over time. And so what I show here is the diffusion of the dominant and parallel discourses from 2000 to 2020 to sort of show the ebb and the flow of the ways that these discourses were diffused. And so you'll see that the circles represent the number of documents that are included in the corpus for that particular year. And so you'll see here around about here, right, we see a lot less. Our circles are smaller, but we also see some interesting shifts, right, when we compare the location and the distance between the gray circles, which represent the parallel discourse and its diffusion over time, to the dominant discourse, where we see that the dominant discourse is still reigning dominantly, but something starts to happen around this time, right? Approximately 2016. So we're about, 2016, 2017, when we're really in the SDGs. And we see that that while the dominant discourse, it sort of flips over here, the distance between them is smaller. And so I found that to be really curious. And for me, this visualization really provided an opportunity to think about really change over time, which is important when we studied discourse diffusion, but it helped me to visualize it in a way that sort of just looking at the text on paper or in the qualitative data management software that I used was not apparent to me. And so using those, the trends that I observed in the data as a way to organize the analysis, I'm going to focus today on three big themes that came from the analysis and as I updated it, for publication, the recent publication. So I'm going to organize it in three ways. I'm going to focus on the ways that girls were sort of gotten to through the MDGs. So getting to girls as a population of interest is something that was really unique that has been happening over the era. I'm also going to talk about the ways that sort of engaging men and boys legitimated or sought to legitimate policy discourses that focused on girls. And then we're going to trouble what we think about when we consider girls' education in a post-empowerment context. And to do that, I'll share some illustrative quotes from the data that will help to really bring those themes into view. And so here I also share this, I think, a really, really important statement that was shared with me by someone who works as a digital strategist in the girls' education space. And in making sense of the diffusion of these discourses and how we apply them, this person shared with me that the idea is that there's, on one end, there's this individual woman, but on the other end, there's everything that surrounds her. And they talked about it as like layers of an onion, which I thought was really, really compelling. And then immediately in qualifying how they were talking about women, they put in girls, right? It says, oh, a woman or a girl, I should say. And so this is an example of the kinds of ways that we take for granted how we talk about girls as a population of interest, particularly in the context of these dominant discourses that really situate girls' education as a capacity builder, as a pathway to women's economic empowerment. And so when I thought about how it is that we got to girls, this development consultant with whom I spoke said that I'm constantly looking to see where and to make sure that girls are not just assumed as an add-on to what women need, because their empowerment is spoken about quite differently in a lot less detail than women's empowerment when we get down to it. And so the idea of getting to girls was a slow and incremental and deliberative process over time. And so in the article, I speak about the ways that policy actors shared what it was like to actually get girls named in the policy documents that became, in the policy consultations rather, that became what the MDGs were. And so again, we see this idea of additive, adding girls to a policy structure that was already privileging women, that guess what, was really privileging men. And so Karen Monkman talks about this in her work as add girls and stir. And I think that that's the best way to think about the implications for what it means when we have a policy structure that's supported by discourses where girls are everywhere and absent. And one of the most interesting things that happened and as I've been doing this work over time, is thinking about where it was that we started talking about boys and men and why that matters. And so in the data, I'm able to show that that we have this that yoked population targeting sort of when it involves boys sort of starts to happen around 2007. And so from 2007 on, we see these incremental sort of additions to policy discourses that in the previous years were only sort of connected with women and girls, to a shift to connect girls' education and boys' education. And so so again, because a lot of the document analysis, all of the document analysis was featured documents from UNGEI and UN Women, those two organizations were important to this work because they are the two UN actors who were most explicitly charged with the advancement of the status of girls and women in all of the things that they do. And so while UNGEI works on girls' education issues specifically, its work is often divorced from the work that UN Women does, even though that UN Women funds and supports a lot of work in the girls' education space. And so for me, as I worked with the data, it became really interesting to see how policies that were focused, that it took so long to get girls even named in, we began to see boys kind of sneaking in. And so rather than approaching that as a conversation on sort of the danger of binaries, it was interesting to me to think about how it is that we organize populations, right, of interest, particularly target populations, and then what happens when we split, like we split the gender piece of it, and we also co-locate the issues of girls and boys within an international and education development context whose needs are very, very different. And so building from that, I was able to begin to think about how girls' education would sort of be approached, right, or be placed in international development agendas after this idea of empowerment. Because as we know, empowerment has been co-opted for use across so many settings. You know, if you are on social media and you search hashtag empowerment, you're going to find a lot of stuff. But most of that stuff is probably associated with gender in some way, most often associated with female gender. And so as I spoke with policy, with girls' education policy actors, and in this case, a development consultant, about like, what do we even mean when we say empowerment when it means everything? And this person had, I think, a really important perspective for those of us who study education policy discourse, most often from a critical and qualitative perspective, is that the sense making is often sort of missed when we take this really macro, macro level diffusion sort of approach to the analysis. And so this quote has stayed with me since 2014, when it was first uttered by the person with whom I spoke for the research. And so they say, to try to codify aspirations for the world, thinking like, where do you want the world to be in 15 years, which is essentially what the global goals have done, parse them in 15-year agenda increments that really are, sort of carrying through the same ideas with some improvements, right, that have come through consultation. But what does that really mean when we want to make the world, what do we want the world to be in 15 years, is that we put big words like empowerment in it. And so this person's comment about empowerment specifically, I think, is really, really compelling, in that they say, we filled those words with meaning as we went along. And so I think the most interesting thing for me, as I now reflect on this work that has been sort of a marathon, but really a love marathon for me, is how I've filled those words with meaning as I've gone along as a scholar, and also what the implications of the meanings that we make with ideas that are embedded within dominant discourses, and how we work with girls, how we think about international development with, and education within that, and how all of that matters at the practice level. And so to highlight the three big findings that are reflected in the compare paper that I'm really sharing today, is that we know that girls became a population of interest to achieve women's empowerment and gender equality in three ways. One is that girls were brought in to a policy and agenda structure that was really privileged to women. And we know that there's a long history of that within the ways that gender is treated in an international education development context, because girls were brought into a system that privileged women, women were brought into a system that really privileged men. And so we see that sort of replicated as we do and undo gender and age designations when we're targeting populations of interest. And so we also saw that the idea that engaging men and boys created this population interdependence that I refer to in this work and others as yoking, but it was done to sort of give legitimacy to girls' education policy discourses where they were decoupled from women. And so I saw that when girls were talked about as this, again, unique and distinct population, that adding boys sort of first was suggested as a way to give, to this allyhood, right? That we want boys for gender equality, men for gender equality. And then it sort of gave this legitimacy, or it was an effort to seek legitimacy for the girls' education policy discourses that were so widely diffused. And so with that in mind, these days, those of us who are thinking about this work are really sort of wondering what's going to happen next. So as we move from this maybe post-empowerment world of girls' education, and I'm not suggesting that that's happened, the data suggests that it is in process, is that we see a lot of really transformational things happening. One is this idea of girls' education for gender justice. And so we see that spaces, and particularly UNGEI is a field leader in this work. I will draw your attention specifically, if you're interested in these kinds of things, to the Solidarity zine series that they're doing with girls. It's fantastic. But also what you'll see too is that UNGEI is taking a very deliberate role in undoing and questioning the binaries that construct the dominant and parallel discourses that I study in this work. So it's the idea of undoing gender or redoing gender by challenging those binaries, and then thinking about how the discourse will be shaped differently when we begin to, again, push away from narrow binary constructions that are age graded. And so bringing this work sort of to a pause before we open for questions, I want to talk about a couple of things that I think are that have potential implication for this work, and how we in comparative international education, particularly those of us who think about girls' education a lot, are kind of troubling, things that were troubling in our own work. And so one is the idea of representation. And so I spoke about representation when discussing the sampling strategy that I used and maybe things that I would do differently now. And that representation matters in lots of different ways. One is that for me, is that it, by not having a interview sample, right, of policy workers that were not just at that upper level, is that I limited my own opportunity to really understand the sense making that policy workers use when interacting with these discourses that don't sort of sit at the top echelon of decision making. And the other thing that I really want to highlight too is that as I grapple with representation and positionality in my own work, and I think that specifically, as an American-based, US-educated scholar who most often looks at education systems outside of my own country and experience, it really became imperative for me to think about the responsibility of representation. And so to make sure that when we speak with people for the purpose of research, is that we really think about, not limiting our own understanding of what the thing it is that we're interested in. In this case, it's the, discourses that I study, but really making sure that the individuals with whom we speak for interview purposes or otherwise really can help us to think about it not only at one level, but at multiple levels. And so I was also thinking a lot about practical use. So in the piece, I speak about one of the challenges in doing girls' education research within international development is that these discourses and sort of their construction are often sort of distanced or decoupled from practice settings. And so as I spoke with policy workers, then and continuing in my work from really when this work started in 2014, it's become more important to me to make sure that the work that I do has a practical use. And so I, maybe like many of you, come from a classroom teaching background. And so I saw that so many of these discourses that are like robustly diffused in policy making spaces become taken for granted or sort of accepted as what we should do or think by folks that are really at the ground level or at the classroom level. And so I think it's really important and that those of us who are privileged to be in these spaces have the really think about what the implication of our work is when we think about, for me, how these discourses are constructed, how they're diffused, how they're disrupted, and then what that matters when we're talking about real teachers and real kids in schools, and also the great work that's done at the nonprofit and civil society sectors around girls' education all over the world. And so also something that this work has allowed me to do and reflect on is testing my own assumptions about not only what empowerment is, but also what it isn't. And so I've approached this work really throughout, this period of my career as thinking about girls' education within an epistemic community. And so Haas and others talk about it as an epistemic community, as sort of this group of international policy actors, in this case, organizations, sort of the how closely knit and how dense that space between organizations and individual actors are. And so I've begun to test that in a couple of different ways to really think about my own assumption is that, yeah, everybody's kind of on the same page and talking to each other. We're all receiving these discourses and then we're making sense of them, right? But the idea of challenging my own assumptions and thinking about the girls' education space as an epistemic community has become really interesting, because maybe it's not, right? And some of the work that is shared in this article and my work more broadly really kind of pokes holes in that. And so now I'm thinking about really how to test that. And I'm doing some work around using network analysis to think about those questions big, but also to explore them in a way that does have practical use and that thinks about representation in those spaces. And so I also want to draw your attention as I invite questions and conversation on this work or other ideas that maybe our time together has sparked for you, to think about this work as it's situated in our broader community. And so I offer here not citations for things that I referenced directly in the presentation, because all of that is available in the full reference list for the published copy, again, and compare. But these are the things that I have read over the years and continue to sort of be, some of this, most of this is new, that have really helped me to think and rethink about my work. And so I just want to give a little sort of shout out to how the community in girls' education and international development, really that's situated within the Comparative International Education Society, has really helped me to think and rethink my own understanding of empowerment and how discourses are constructed and why it matters for us to think about those things, not just in our little corner of the literature, but to be mindful of the work that's happening outside of our discrete areas of expertise. And so here are some really smart women that I read, and I encourage you to take a look at their work, both in what's I include here. These pieces have meant a lot to me, but also to draw your attention to this new CIES Gender Justice SIG. And so with colleagues Christine Benwood-Tipka, Catherine Vanner, and Christy Kelly, our work in Comparative Education Review that was published over the summer reflected and reported on a 3-year research project where we looked at sort of gender within the context of the work of the Gender and Education Society of CIES. And so our findings really suggest that women of color and women from the Global South do not feel that that CIES is a welcoming space for them, for their work and for their professional and scholarly development. And I want to draw your attention specifically to Esther Ojito's contribution to the moderated discussion that was along with our piece in this issue, because she really has helped me, and her work has helped me to think about, how we theorize girls' education across space and place, and the ways that we can think about race and really centering race within those discussions. And so the Gender Justice SIG comes really from the work of my colleagues on the Gender and Education Standing Committee, and specifically the work that's published in CER and that's been in a couple different places. But the Gender Justice SIG came from that work. And so that's where those of us who have been and remain committed to thinking about gender equity within comparative international education have come together to really mobilize that work more at the membership level in CIES in a way that will help the GEC as a standing committee really revisit its mandate to ensure that all NCIS feel that it is a home for them in the way that it has been for so many of us. And so I invite you to engage with this work to help you to think about too the ways that you're doing and undoing gender and why it matters when we're talking about girls' education in an international development context, and to see how the discourses that we take for granted every day really are reflected over time and why that matters. So thank you so much for your listening, and I'm really excited to be in conversation with you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anderson. That was really interesting. So let's open it up for questions. Anyone have a question for Dr. Anderson?
I have a question. Can I ask one before all the other questions start? So
Of
Emily,
course.
that was fascinating, and I've obviously been following your work for a few years. So I'm glad to see you've really you've taken it to some interesting places. I wanted to just go back to the idea of the different discourses: the dominant, the parallel, the conflicted. I think that was it. And I wonder. So you and I have colleagues, both domestically and internationally, who talk a lot about a boys' crisis. And they position this boys' crisis as part of the gender inequality discourse. What do you think about that? Is there a boys' crisis? Is there a dichotomy there where there's a girls' crisis and a boys' crisis, but they have different sort of contexts? How does that fit within this overall conversation?
Thank you so much for that question, Alex. Yeah, that is something that has really been on my mind for a really long time. And so I can tell you how I'm thinking about it now. That I think that the idea, anytime we're going to talk about a crisis, we really need to talk about whose crisis and how crisis itself is framed and within the context of education as a way to solve whatever problem is associated with that crisis in time. And so I think that the idea of a crisis, and we've written about this a bit too, is that first is a red flag for me. And so when I'm thinking about if we're calling something a crisis, then there has to be, for me, sort of, more implications past what happens at the school level. And so often the ways that I think about that have been, the same ways that the dominant discourse around women's girls' education for women's empowerment has sort of been situated. And so at first, early in my career, I just was completely dismissive and to say, boys' crisis, not a thing. It's a sort of co-opted way to think about sort of changing the social, sort of our social and cultural understandings of gender and how we do and undo gender in our life. And so when we couple those ideas of linking boys to sort of linking boys to girls' education, at first I was really, and to be frank, I'm still kind of, still don't know how, I got some feelings about it. But it's okay there are problems in education that affect boys uniquely than girls, for sure. What we see when we look at those discourses around boys' crisis, the way I look at them is thinking about them in a particular regional context. And so in the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, which is obviously an area of interest for Alex and maybe many of you in this room, is that there's been a lot of published work, but really just in that region around the crisis for boys. So Natasha Ridge has many pieces that are out on that. And she and I are, when we're in conversation about these issues, it's really helped me to think about not only sort of unpacking the crisis logic, right, but also seeing how difference becomes crisis. And so a lot of this, as we talk about discourse and we're making sense of it in real time, that's what we're doing right now, right? And so much of that matters in time and place. And in the GCC context, in the UAE in particular, there are the ways that the boys' crisis is talked about is sort of looking at this generational issue. And so that less, we see this when we look at, at work that uses large scale international testing data all over the world, right? Where we see that girls consistently outperform boys in most places all over the world in most subjects. We see that there's some distance, right? And when math, particularly looking at the TIMSS data, but we also see girls' advantage in things like collaborative problem solving when we look at PISA. So this has all sort of been used to weaponize girls' successes to focus on boys' comparative quote unquote disadvantage. But when we're thinking about it in if we're playing the long game, if you will, where we're thinking about the generational issues or change over time, right? Is that for me, for there to be a crisis, that would deserve the same sort of policy attention that girls' education deserves, then there would be sort of these adult social mobility and other sort of indicators that would show a disadvantage. And so that might look at, you know, some of the things like the UN, the global goals have privileged is like increasing the number of women that are in parliamentary seats all over the world, right? Increasing the number of women who are in non-agrarian jobs. And then the other one is to measure and monitor women and girls' education attainment over time. And so if that means, if there's really a crisis for boys in that, then we would expect to see things like labor market issues, right? And so again, that's all dominant discourse, that the reason that we go to school is so that we can get jobs and contribute to our family's economy, but more specifically GDP, right? That's not a secret. So for me, I would need to see from just my own Emiliness, sort of those disadvantages that were happening later in life. And at least in the Gulf cooperation country context, we don't see that. What we see is that boys who are educated that become men in jobs have different opportunities for economic sort of empowerment than women do, regardless of education. And so I think of that where boys are situated, where the boys are is where I talk about it in the work, right? That it's a smaller story for me than thinking about girls' education, because the problems are more, I think, niched. And maybe I hope that we don't see, you know, the kinds of decline that some of our colleagues are sort of expecting to see, or sort of positioning that we'll see with boys' educational disadvantage. But frankly, we just don't see them yet. And so for me, that's thing one. Thing two is that we also can't discount the process of being educated, right? The nuts and bolts of the things that we do in being schooled that then impact what happens, you know, later on. And so the things that I'm interested these days is I always take sort of a more macro approach when I'm trying to understand a thing. And so understanding this, I feel like to the level that I'm able to now in the ways that I am, what's more curious for me is what's happening more at the practice level. And so how the experience of being educated, particularly for girls, sort of gets lost in the shuffle when we talk about all the gains that are made at the end. And so only using the dominant discourse wants us to sort of on board with this idea that school equals economic empowerment, everybody's cool, right? And I just think there's way more to that. And so when we look at that from a gender and equity perspective, it really, for me, changes the responsibility I have to think about the pieces that get left, the small but important things that happen as girls are educated that might get lost in the big story when we just talk about the successes that girls have. So thank you for your question. And friends, I apologize. I have not been looking at the chat so that I could stay focused, but I will ask Jacob and Alex to maybe make it available if there's any questions that are coming up there or anything that you wanted to share in terms of place and how you come to this talk today.
Other questions for Dr. Anderson? Yeah, Will Smith.
One of my favorite people in the world.
Hey, Emily, it's so good to see you.
Good to see you.
So thanks for the presentation. Good stuff. I was wondering, I know we both look at kind of global goals and practices, and we look at them very differently.
Mm-hmm.
So wondering how some of our worlds overlap some. Mm-hmm. So you're looking at the dominant discourse from like 2000 to 2020. Mm-hmm. And I was quite interested in that. I was wondering, I look a lot at the indicators and global goals, whether or not the discourse evolves or the dominant discourse might have changed, or we saw kind of a decrease in emphasis kind of at the SDG level in 2016, where the parallel discourses started to play a little more prominently. Mm-hmm. If you can talk about the relationship between the evolution of a discourse and the availability of information.
Ooh, yeah.
So is it that when we think about the dominant discourse as a binary age piece, are we seeing it weaken because there's additional information beyond binary age?
Yeah.
Or is it pushing for new information? So can you talk a little bit about the relationship you might have seen between those?
Sure. And so I will actually kind of go off book a little bit and answer your question through other ways that I've approached the work that I've shared with you. And so the other, so part of the big chunk of the things that I do in my scholarship looks at cultural diffusion, right? And so we can think about cultural diffusion of policy discourses, policy scripts in documents like we do, right? And so you look at those sort of trends over time using large scale, achievement data. And so both of those, I think, play into a system that helps us, that creates the language that we use, right? Or that legitimates the language that we use to talk about change over time, and particularly about gender. Your question about information, right? Access to information, I think, is something that is what's super interesting to me, and it plays out in my work quite a bit. And so one of the things that I don't talk about in this article, but I've talked about in lots of other places, is the role of social media in diffusing dominant discourses, particularly the ones that I'm interested in and have researched, during this phase of my work. And so we know that Twitter and Instagram, I haven't looked at, I made some decisions not to incorporate Facebook in my analysis, but I have looked a lot at how Instagram sort of constructs, using visual intensive media, constructs policy ideas and diffuse discourse. And so we know that the widespread use of social media and sort of the explosion of ICT over the past 20 years has really changed how we access information, but it's also changed how we engage with that information. And so absolutely, social media plays a huge role in diffusing discourses. It also plays a really important role in disrupting them. And so, as I don't talk about it in this article, but in some other work, that one of the things that I saw when working with data that was sourced from Twitter, from the United Nations, from UNGEI and UN Women's Twitter accounts, because they have a few, at the time they had a few, is that I kept seeing things that were tweeted that didn't make any sense to me, being sort of really nested in this work for a long time. And so over time, I was able to see those little things that didn't make sense as part of the this discourse disruption that I talk about in this piece. And so what we might first see is like somebody maybe pushing back a little bit, or again, I only look at the organizational level for lots of reasons that we can talk about in another time if anybody's interested. I only look at organizations and sort of organizational policy talk, but I saw that those small disruptions began to sort of seed and spread when I was able to look at when a tweet was made to then looking at the policy documents that followed a year later. And so I think that from a research perspective, or just a curiosity perspective, that the ways that we can think about social media, there's ways that we can think about social media in how we access information, and also the roles that we as individuals play in diffusing that information by likes, by retweets, by regramming. I have not thought about TikTok at all. And so I think that moving forward, that's going to be sort of an interesting thing when anybody can sort of make content that is, that is professional-ish, right? And how that changes the way we think about expertise. It changes the ways that we think about who matters in a policy conversation. And the thing that's most exciting for me is the way that adolescent girls in particular use virtual exchange as a way to disrupt these discourses that are imposed on them as a way to break through them. So I'm really excited. That's some of the work that I'm doing now with a wonderful group of collaborators. And I really appreciate your question, Will, and thanks for being here.
Thanks, Emily. Can I come back to you real quick on something? Is that okay, Jacob?
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks. So looking at the increased information and how that can kind of shape new discourse or disrupt old discourses, going back to the global goals that we've got, to 2030 for the SDGs, when I look at like SDG 4 or 5, and I look at the different ways the SDGs are being disaggregated, I see it as potentially, potentially putting a straitjacket on a different view of gender, right? So it's very much by sex. It is that binary aged understanding. We look at how we are measuring equity issues in education. I guess my question is, as increased information comes up, is there space to shape these? Because when I'm looking at how the SDGs play out in something like voluntary national reviews, I see countries that are very rigid in how they're presenting information. And so they're not encouraged to actually be more open and, let's say, a definition of gender than the way they're typically reporting boys and girls, right? And so just wondering, like, in the future a little bit, can move away from feminist discourse? Do you see enough counter discourses to where we might be looking at global goals in 2030 differently, and might having a different view of gender in the next global goals? And can that shape how we, collect information and how people put out policy?
Yeah, great question. And I'm conscious of time, and so I will answer a bit of it. And then that's a great space for us to all be in thinking and conversation together. The question is so smart. So here's what I know. I know, based on the data, or what I think I know is based on the data and how I've worked with it, is that I do see that there is this shift that's happening, particularly from little early days of the SDGs until now. And so that shift is really pushing back on the dominant discourse in ways that suggest to me that the dominant discourse isn't going anywhere, but that parallel space is what becomes sort of the change, sort of where the change takes place, or where the change is really kicked off, right? And so when discourses are disrupted, particularly around gender, we sort of see it poking out, right? In the ways that we talk about children and youth, the way that we use words like boys and girls, and also non-binary youth, which is, again, I referenced the work that UNGEI is doing in particularly, and they're doing that through collaboration with girls. And so while I can't necessarily speak to how we're going to classify people, right? Because that's what population targeting is, in order to count them for particular purposes, that allows us to do, large scale quantitative work and thinking about how gender is parsed within that. I do not expect there to be any change from the dominant discourse in my lifetime. Instead, I expect that the dominant discourse will be differently influenced by the inclusion of different ways of thinking about and classifying people within education in ways that reflects not only who they really are, in ways that they can be self-actualized to share into and to construct for themselves and to communicate and be known by, but also how we sort of count that. And so that's the place where I feel like those of us who do international comparative work, either using, documents, which is where I sort of live most of the time, to the work that you do and Alex does, and to a certain extent, and maybe other people in the room, is that we're going to have to see how it plays over time, right? I think it'll be super cool when we can see the check your box indicators in forms, right? That's always a thing where I'm like, okay, things are changing. We see that in our professional societies, where we're not just asked to necessarily disclose who we are based on our gender identities as within that binary construction. But I think the more, and this is really apparent, this is really part of, I think, all of our responsibilities for those of us who think about gender, is to really see how we're counted and why that matters. And so things like the work, again, I'll reference from the comparative ed review piece that myself and my colleagues have published most recently, is that we're really saying that, like, counting people really isn't the best idea, but it does have some utility for all the ways that we know. And so just to, sort of put a pin in that great question in my response to it, Will, I would suggest that I think we all need to pay attention to what's happening in real time, because the things we take for granted ultimately become the things that we all accept. So I appreciate your question, and I'm really looking forward to maybe how all of our thinking can come together to really trouble those ideas in new ways. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for engaging us for the hour. I'm conscious of time as well, so I just want to thank you again, Emily, for giving such a great talk. I've put Dr. Anderson's email in the chat in case anyone would like to follow up with questions that you have. This recording will be available, as always, on our website. And so thank you again, Dr. Anderson.
Thanks very much for having me. Thanks to see all y'all. Be well.
All right, that does it for us. We will see you in 2 weeks for the next brown bag. Take care, everyone.